Hi everyone, Samir and Sumit here, and welcome back to our F1 podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2024 Belgian Grand Prix.
Yeah, and boy, does this season keep continuing to deliver. I mean, this race had pretty much everything you would want to see. I mean, like intense strategies of wheel to wheel racing and even like post race controversy too.
I know, I feel like I said this about last race as well, but it seems like this race had everything, and it was just really an enjoyable race. I mean, Spa always seems to deliver,
Yeah.
and so this weekend was definitely no different, and I think it was just definitely up there, but just Formula One in 2024 continuing to deliver.
Yeah, so going on into this weekend, the main talking points were going to see kind of how the team order situation would go down at McLaren because obviously, first of all, this was a track where they struggled a little bit last year, so it was going to be interesting to see whether they would have that same speed here as they did last year, or whether this newly upgraded McLaren would be able to fight for the win. And if they were fighting for the win, who would be the driver that they prioritized?
Yeah, I think that last question you said is more realistic because I think now we've seen that across the season they have the fastest car that is capable of winning. But I think, like you said, it's now going to be of which McLaren driver will win the race because McLaren need to sort out their team issues if they want to well and truly fight for this world championship. But also another thing that was going on into this race weekend was that it was confirmed that Max Verstappen and Yuki Tsunoda would both be
Yeah.
taking engine penalties for exceeding engine allocations. For Tsunoda, it would be the entire engine, and I think for Verstappen, it was just the internal combustion engine.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, Verstappen, the last 3 years or 2 years in a row, we've seen him take engine penalties at Spa, and both those years he's clawed back his way to win from 14th or below 10th on the grid. So we'd
Yeah.
see whether this year he could, but there was a lot of doubt about whether he actually could. Maybe a podium would be possible for him, but it definitely seemed like Red Bull wouldn't necessarily be there to challenge for the win.
Yeah, and speaking of challenging for the win, they needed Sergio Perez to step up, especially with Max Verstappen taking a 10 place grid penalty. So it was crucial that Perez this weekend found his form, unlike what we've seen in the last couple of races, to not only help Red Bull in the Constructors' Championship, but also to kind of save his F1 drive because this is the last race before the summer break. So Red Bull would be taking a decision over the summer break to analyze what Perez's performances were and whether he would be fit to continue for the second half of the season. So it's a do or die situation for Perez this weekend.
hmm So going on now into FP1, then drivers had to lay rubber into this track, obviously, because it was really cool conditions and the track was kind of slippery at first, and obviously the cold temperatures at Spa make the track
Hmm.
inherently hard to grip up, and so drivers were just exploring how far they could go in FP1, and we saw a couple drivers struggling, like Sergio Perez and his Red Bull. Already from the
Yeah.
get go, he was struggling. He didn't have a feeling, he said, of what the car was gonna do in all types of corners. So Perez already kind of starting on the back foot. And another driver starting on the back foot was Esteban Ocon in his Alpine. He had an engine issue immediately in that new Deadpool themed livery, which
Yeah.
is pretty cool to see. But Alpine already having reliability issues in the midst of rumors that they might be ditching their Renault power unit to go to
Yeah.
Mercedes power in 2026. So definitely not a good look for that Alpine team. And that unfortunately meant that Esteban Ocon had to spend almost the entire session in the garage.
Yeah, it was also confirmed this weekend that Esteban Ocon would be racing for Haas next year alongside
hmm
Oliver Behrman. So an interesting move from his side and a good move for Haas in my opinion.
Yeah, because it's not like Ocon isn't a slow driver. He's really
Yeah.
fast. I mean, it's just his defense moves that are questionable.
Yeah.
But I think that partnership will be a really strong partnership. I know, in terms of pace, it'll be. I don't know how well they might get off track come the end of the season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It'll be definitely good for Haas to have that experience in a Grand Prix winner and
hmm
also to have that youth in Ollie Behrman. And it would just be interesting to see how they get along on track.
Yeah. So continuing with FP1 then now. Just a lot of drivers. This session was just drivers basically just finding how much they could push on this track as the track was consistently getting faster. they were just constantly making setup changes and stuff. Cause Spa's interesting. The first sector you want really high speed, low downforce because obviously you
Yeah.
have that monster corner Eau Rouge and then the long camel straight. But then the second sector is so much downforce needed, and so it almost makes the first sector irrelevant. And then going back to the third sector, then all of a sudden that's high speed again. So just a Spa requires a unique setup, and also it was like predicted that there might be rain in qualifying and stuff.
Yeah.
So it would be like weird to see how they would set up the qualifying car versus the race car because you can't change that due to park farm rules. So a lot of stuff to be excited about after FP1.
Yeah, so concluding FP1 then, Max Verstappen, no surprise there, was the quickest out of the 20 drivers on the grid. Of course, he's taken the last three pole positions here, so it was no surprise that he was quicker than everyone else. Oscar Piastri was up there in P2 from McLaren, though he was 5 tenths back from the Red Bull, and Alex Albon in P3 with a very surprising result, but good from him and Williams. And then the two Mercedes of Russell and Hamilton in P4 and P5, then Leclerc in P6, and Sergio Perez nearly a second off his teammate in P7, and then Norris in P8, then came Carlos Sainz and Lance Stroll for Aston Martin in 10th.
So going on now into FP2, then this would have been similar conditions to what qualifying would have been had it not been for rain. But so drivers were doing dry quali runs, and the McLarens looked extremely fast, especially in the hands of Lando Norris. And it just looked so stable through the corners when I was watching the onboards. Whereas we
Yeah.
saw other cars like fighting through all the different high speed, low speed corners. Just the McLaren just looked extremely planted, and both drivers seemed really comfortable in their car. So McLaren definitely looking like the team to beat.
Yeah, I also noticed that too when watching the onboards that the McLarens just seemed to be miles ahead of anybody else, but especially Red Bull too seemed to be struggling a little bit compared to both the McLarens because it was a McLaren 1-2. Verstappen was up there in P3 and Perez was only down in P9, so definitely a lot of work for Perez to do on his side of the garage to prepare for Saturday.
Yeah, and also not just Perez though, but Verstappen definitely will need to pay just as much attention because he's going to
Yeah.
be charging through the field, not like where Perez might start further up. Although some people have been saying even with the engine penalty, Verstappen might still out qualify
Yeah.
Perez. But Perez, then we saw him make like a funny comment. He said he was observing the McLaren through a rouge, and people were saying maybe instead of observing other cars, you should focus on your own car.
Yeah,
So
that's valid.
definitely just like Perez needs a good weekend here, and I think at the moment he looks like he's a bit off, but I think the overnight setup work into FP3 definitely
Yeah.
changes fortunes for a lot of drivers. So it would probably help him.
Yeah, the Ferraris also in this session were looking pretty quick, which was a good thing to see, as they also still have a very good chance at the Constructors' Championship because they're not too far behind McLaren as well. But Ferrari just have been so inconsistent this season. They can get a good result here, then maybe they can just follow McLaren and try to close that gap to Red Bull, and maybe we'll have a three-way fight for the Constructors' Championship.
Ferrari definitely need to up their consistency, obviously, and also looking back to Mercedes as well. They look like another team that they've
Yeah.
been kind of underrated, but don't forget they've won two of the last three races. So
Mhm.
Mercedes definitely are a team you can't count out. And although they were down in sixth and 10th, then they definitely would have their work cut out come qualifying. But they definitely would be a team in contention for the podium and possibly the win.
Yeah, a big thing to watch out for in Spa was traffic, and we saw Alex Albon get caught up at the final chicane by a Ferrari, so it would be interesting to see how that would play out come qualifying because, of course, the last chicane can get extremely crowded. If you've seen Formula 2 and Formula 3, then you would know just how crowded the last chicane can get, and it's really annoying for the drivers on fast laps because there's no other route. There's kind of just one line that you have to take through that chicane, and everywhere else is just off the road, and that would just invalidate your lap.
Yeah, it's funny here because despite how long the
Yeah,
track is, you just always see this traffic build up in the last corner. So it'd definitely be interesting to see the communication between driver and engineer. But
Yeah,
also another big thing that came out in between FP1 and FP2 was that it was announced that Bruno Famin would be leaving Alpine as
yeah.
team principal, and it was confirmed later that Oliver Oakes, the team principal of the high tech F2 team, would be stepping in to fill his role. So like in fact the same thing happened exactly at Spa 2023,
Yeah,
where the Otmar's I don't know how you say his last name.
Otmo.
Yeah, but he left the Alpine team, and so just more internal changes happening at the Enstone team.
Yeah, I forgot about Otmar. He's a very funny guy to have around the paddock, I'm sure. But
Now going into FP3, then this was the start of the wet day, the usual spa weather here, and it was extremely wet for FP3. And knowing these would be conditions for qualifying, the drivers were eager to get out and test the conditions and make sure they had a good understanding of the wet conditions at Spa.
yeah, so we could see throughout the session. Then throughout the session, obviously it started off with pretty heavy, intense rain. The lap times immediately just the best they could get were the low 2 minutes. So of course, like not at all anywhere near close to the times we would see in the dries. But Max Verstappen was again the quickest, and that's no surprise. We obviously know how good Max Verstappen is in the wet, and especially at Spa. If you remember back to that 2021 qualifying where he was able to take pole and inherit the race win in a way. But most drivers ended up waiting for the majority of the session to clear up, as like they waited for until it got late in the session to where the rain started to clear up so that they could get their runs in, because that those were the conditions that they were going to see like most realistic to qualifying. So they waited for a long time before they went out on track.
Yeah, it was kind of a pattern of like it was raining initially, and then so the drivers went out, and then it just rained too much. And there was also a red flag actually because Lance Stroll spun at Eau
Yeah,
Rouge. It was similar to Norris's crash in 2021, but thankfully Stroll was okay. Just showing
yeah.
the safety of Formula One cars this week or this in this time period. But we saw a bunch of drivers initially and later just going off everywhere. Like we saw
Yeah.
Oscar Piastri go off at Pouon, Sergio Perez go off at what was that turn? Like turn 8, and then we saw Carlos Sainz also go off at Stavolo, and so just a bunch of just testing the waters, like literally testing the waters as it was
Yeah.
raining a lot. And so drivers then after FP3 would be really crucial to analyze how they could tune that setup come qualifying.
Yeah, so to conclude FP3, then it was Verstappen in P1 ahead of Piastri again in P2. Gasly up there in P3. Now, Gasly, we know, has gone pretty well around Spa. Last year, he took the sprint podium with P3. So and Alpine obviously looking pretty good here because Ocon was there in P5. Norris was up there in P4. And Perez was all the way down in P10. So just not good at all for him and not what he needed right before qualifying, because if he started P10 and Verstappen took pole, then they'd still be lining up P10 and P11. So what Red Bull need is for Sergio Perez to take P2 at least so that he can inherit pole position and continue to lead the race maybe and do what he did last year where he stayed all the way up in the lead until Verstappen came by.
Exactly, because McLaren have been taking out points by each race
Hmm.
through Red Bull's constructors championship lead, and while Verstappen has been extending his drivers championship lead, Red Bull are most concerned about their constructors
Yeah.
lead, and so Perez, it would be crucial for him to deliver, like you said, not just for the championship but for his own future.
Yeah, and so Leclerc was there in P6 for a Ferrari. Then Stroll in P7, despite the crash, he was still there in P7. Then Bottas in P8. Hamilton only down in ninth, and then Sergio Perez in P10.
So going on now to qualifying, and immediately already we saw that traffic, like you talked about, building up in the final corner. We saw Verstappen get kind of hindered by Zhou Guanyu in the Sauber, and Verstappen was immediately on it because not only in is it just ruin your lap, but also in these rainy conditions, it can be really serious and cause a really serious accident. So drivers just keen to have clean laps, not just for their times, but also for their own safety. But coming towards the end of Q1, then we saw drivers the track was just getting faster, and so were the drivers. Hulkenberg went up to P11. Fernando Alonso went up to P7 in the Aston Martin. We had Piastri first and Gasly second. So Gasly showing that the track really was getting quicker. We saw it was Valtteri Bottas. He went up to P8. So in that kick Sauber, he was just all the time just getting quicker and quicker, and it was about who could actually get across the line last to start their lap that would actually go up the furthest.
Yeah, then we saw Sergio Perez in a very important lap for him as he was only down in P14 and he wasn't improving in the first sector. But come the end of the lap, he was able to find time and go up all the way into P4. Albon improved up to P11 and then Ricardo went all the way up to P8, so it was a good effort from him. Then Carlos Sainz was currently in the drop zone, so he needed a good lap, but he went up into P5, so the track just getting faster and faster, and it was all about who was on the track at this moment and setting a lap, and kind of whoever crossed the line last would kind of have the best track conditions, except Yuki Tsunoda, who only went up to P18, so he was out of qualifying, but it didn't really matter anyway as he would start all the way in last.
So the drivers we lost in that session were Yuki Tsunoda, Logan Sargent, Joe Guan Yu, and both Haas cars, Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen.
Yeah.
So really, those were the big shocks of Q1 in my opinion, because especially Hulkenberg, we expected to see that Haas much further up into the high Q2s, maybe even Q3 potentially.
Yeah, especially this would not be good for the team as they just signed a new driver. Now both these drivers getting out in Q1 is definitely not what Ocon would want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he's used to it at this point with the Alpine, though.
Yeah.
So now going into Q2, then it was just continuing the rain-filled session, and we saw drivers again just being in the right place at the right time. That was Esteban Ocon, who had went up to a provisionally P4. Pierre Gasly from the drop zone went to P7, so still behind his teammate. Then we looked to the two Mercedes, who were still in the drop zone and looking to improve their lap times. George Russell, he crossed the line and he did improve his time, so he went up out of the drop zone into P2. And Lewis Hamilton, who had a pretty bad first sector, flew through the middle sector, and Hamilton was absolutely flying. And as he crossed the line, he also improved his time and he went up to P2. So both Mercedes just again on track when it's getting faster and faster, and just proving that they have a really solid car in all conditions, as they were the perfect example in my opinion of building up the weekend.
Yeah, and so other drivers were now trying to improve their times. Albon went up into P9, crucially though behind Sergio Perez. So Perez was now continuously slipping down the order, but Albon hadn't improved his time enough to beat Perez. Leclerc went up to P5. Perez was now pushed down to P9, and then as Sainz completed his lap, Perez was pushed down to P10, so Albon was out of qualifying, and Bottas looked like he was the only one who could challenge for Q3 now, but he couldn't improve his time. So Perez got super lucky. By just 3/1000ths of a second, he was able to survive and get back into Q3.
Yeah, really important for Perez. Like, I saw people say he was 3 thousandths away from losing his seat, and
Yeah.
at this point it kind of was, because Red Bull could not afford Perez to be out in Q2 in a weekend where Verstappen was taking an engine penalty. So nevertheless, good job from Perez to deliver into Q3.
Yeah, so going into Q3 now, Hamilton and Russell were the first of the front runners to complete their times. And as Hamilton crossed the line, he couldn't be beat, he beat his teammate George Russell, but Piastri looked the quicker of the cars out on track, and he crossed the line though, but lost time in the final chicane and couldn't end up beating Lewis Hamilton, but it was really close, just separated by 1/100th of a second. But Ocon was flying through the first sector and he went up into P4, but he was the fourth driver to cross the line, so it didn't really matter anyway. Norris was the big one to watch out for, and he went up to only into P4. So as we've seen so far this weekend, Norris just consistently looked off the pace of his teammate, and that wasn't really good for his drivers' championship hopes, because he would certainly need a good qualifying to start well ahead of Verstappen and outscore his championship rival.
Yeah, so then we waited for the two Red Bulls after we saw both Ferraris, interestingly, were 7th and 8th, and so that might have been tire difference as well. but they were just genuinely lacking pace as it looked like so far. Then we saw Sergio Perez cross the line to go 2 tenths ahead of Lewis Hamilton into P1, and then Verstappen by 6 tenths to Sergio Perez went up into P1. So Red Bull currently 1 and 2, and exactly what Red Bull would have wanted to see, because that would have meant Perez started on pole and Verstappen would have had major damage limitation.
Yeah, so going on into the final set of runs, then Sainz looked like he wasn't going to improve his time, and Leclerc definitely looked like the quicker of the two Ferraris. So as Sainz crossed the line, he couldn't improve his time and was only down there in P7, so it was a poor qualifying from him. But as Leclerc crossed the line, out of nowhere, Leclerc went up to P2, which would have been an inherent pole position, and that was a super lap from Leclerc to get up onto the front row, and a very crucial lap for himself and Ferrari, especially because Verstappen wasn't improving at all and Perez wasn't improving either. So Leclerc, as it stood, was going to take pole position.
Yeah, it was a brilliant lap from Leclerc. Remember, he was in like P7, P8, and
P8,
so
yeah.
he didn't like look anywhere. The Ferraris didn't look anywhere, and Sainz was P8. So Leclerc pulling it out of nowhere to go into P2 was just a really brilliant lap. We call him Mr. Qualifying, and he delivered once again,
Yeah.
albeit 6 tenths behind Verstappen. But come the dry race, it would be entirely different. So Charles Leclerc taking that pole position was really, really special to see. And Perez couldn't improve. But nevertheless, it was a good effort from Sergio Perez
Yeah.
because that'll be on the front row. And like you said, exactly what Red Bull wanted.
Yeah, so the final order then for qualifying was Verstappen in P1 for now, the fastest driver, but then came Leclerc who would take pole position ahead of Perez, Hamilton, Norris. So Norris in the end ended up out qualifying his teammate Oscar Piastri right when it mattered. Then came Piastri in P6, Russell in P7, then Sainz in P8. He would be very disappointed with that. Then Alonso in P9 and then Ocon in P10. Somewhat underwhelming for Alpine considering where they were in the other two qualifying sessions.
So going on now into the main race, it would be interesting to see as it was a dry grid set on a wet qualifying, so that always makes things interesting. We had
Yeah.
Leclerc on pole and Perez on the front row, and then we had the Mercedes behind, and then the McLarens intermingled in that too. So it was just all in all really exciting to see the start.
Yeah, so as the lights came on and as they went out, then Leclerc got a really good start and he was able to bolt into the lead ahead of Hamilton, who was now challenging Sergio Perez. And Hamilton actually took second place into the first corner, but Perez held his ground on the outside and was able to retake the second place. But they were wheel to wheel into Eau Rouge, and Hamilton just had the better speed and was able to get ahead of Perez and into second. Then came Lando Norris in P4 ahead of the Mercedes of George Russell. So it was a really good start from Russell, but a poor start from Perez as he had just lost out to Hamilton. And now as they headed to the Lecombe chicane, Leclerc had an insane lead over the rest of the field, and he was able to defend enough to keep his P1, which was crucial for him.
Yeah, so Leclerc maintaining that lead into the Lecombe chicane. Hamilton second, Perez shuffled down to third, and for at turn one we saw Lando Norris get wide to take avoiding action, but he went a bit too wide. He made another mistake at turn one, which we've seen him do time and time again.
Yeah.
And he went wide into that gravel and lost 3 or 4 positions. So Norris just completely ruining that start. And I think later
So
at
it
the
was
end
Piastri then up there right behind Hamilton and Perez.
yeah, Piastri was in P4 and Russell was right behind Piastri. So Norris, I think, also said that start also ruined his race.
Yeah.
So definitely Norris needing to figure out something to change with his start procedure. But nevertheless, he would have to deal. He would have to worry about that later and deal with his current predicament right now. But then we saw Sainz right behind George Russell, and Norris was there too. And then we saw Max Verstappen have a really good start, and he was already challenging Alex Albon and the Aston Martin as they went through turn 8.
Yeah, and to end off lap one, Verstappen made the move on Albon into the bus stop chicane. He went from the outside, which turned to the inside, and it was a really good move from him to get past the Williams.
So Max Verstappen just continuously trying to charge through the field, and Albon getting shuffled back. He was desperate to hang on to the Red Bull though, because if he
Yeah.
could try to stay, if Verstappen could try to tow him along, then that would be really good for the Williams driver, because that would mean he could potentially slingshot his way up into the points essentially.
Yeah, so going on into lap three now, Hamilton had closed up significantly to Leclerc, and now we could see that Mercedes clearly had the best race car out of all of the other teams, and Hamilton was able to breeze past Leclerc into the Les Combes chicane, and Hamilton took the lead of the Belgian Grand Prix after starting way down compared to Leclerc. And this was not what Red Bull needed, especially because that should have been Perez in their eyes to take the lead ahead of Leclerc.
Exactly, and it wasn't like Perez was just sticking. He was right
Yeah.
there to potentially make a move. Perez had already dropped back 2 seconds to the Ferrari and Mercedes. So Perez struggling initially. Maybe we would see after the pit stops, could that potentially reverse the damage? But they made the pit stops on lap 12, and Lewis Hamilton, he exited the pit lane on lap 12 behind one of the Alpine cars, and Piastri came back behind George Russell. So George Russell had got ahead of Oscar Piastri as they went up through Eau Rouge.
Yeah, so going on now into lap 13, then it was a good on going on to lap 13, then the McLaren of Oscar Piastri was right there behind Sergio Perez, challenging for P6 in the race, and Perez's race was just now going from bad to worse after starting on the front row. Now he saw Oscar Piastri breeze past him, and Piastri was now on a charge to go chase after the front runners and attempt for a podium here. But it was not good at all from Perez after being on a slower tire. In fact, he was on the mediums and Piastri was on the hards. So the mediums clearly looking like a poor race tire to be on.
Yeah, I think Perez was also just struggling because also Piastri had fresher tires as well. So immediately after his pit stop, Piastri got past George Russell and then immediately got past Sergio Perez. So like you said, Piastri was trying to charge for the win at this point.
Yeah, going on into lap 16, then Lando Norris made his pit stop, and that was to cover off the one of the other front runners of the Mercedes of George Russell. It was. Then we saw in the lead Carlos Sainz, who had inherited the race lead. He had now lost control of his Ferrari and went off into the gravel at the end of the lap. Towards it was turn 14. It was. He lost the rear of his Ferrari. Luckily, he didn't beach his Ferrari though in the gravel, and he was able to keep it on the track somewhat and keep control of his Ferrari. But he had just lost any pit stop window or pit stop gap that he would have created before. So that was just his race ruined pretty much from that.
And going on now into lap 21, speaking of races ruined, it just went from bad to worse for Sergio Perez as George Russell overtook Sergio Perez, and Perez was about to lose another position to his teammate Max Verstappen, who had closed all the way up into the top five. So Perez just struggling and Verstappen making great progress in his charge through the field.
Yeah, and on lap 26, we saw George Russell say to the team to think about a one stop. And I was pretty surprised when I first heard this message. I didn't really expect him to be serious about it, to take the one stop all the way. I thought it was just kind of to trick the other teams. And like we've seen it time and time again, teams have these messages they say to the drivers, or the drivers say to the team to trick the other teams into pulling a early pit stop or something like that. But I thought it was one of these messages, but clearly it wasn't, as Russell was seriously thinking of the pit stop. But on that same lap, we did see the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton come into the pits to make his second pit stop of the race.
Yeah, so I was like also like you said really surprised because Russell put those tires on at like lap 12,
11,
lap
lap
13,
11.
lap 11, yeah. So like taking those laps for the next like 33 laps at Spa, which has a really long lap. So I
Yeah.
was really surprised to see whether Russell could actually do that. But going down to lap 31, Perez just continued to fall down the field, and he got overtaken by Lando Norris in the McLaren, and Norris was closing into the back of Max Verstappen. So Norris was also trying to charge down his teammate and the other Red Bull of Max Verstappen.
Yeah, we're going on to lap 34 then. At this point in the race, now Hamilton was looking to close the gap to Russell, who had now officially just been trying to go with this one stop. It was just 10 laps to go, so he had no choice but to just keep this one stop. And he was about 5.5 seconds ahead of his teammate Hamilton, but Hamilton was closing up quickly. But another man who was closing up quickly was Oscar Piastri, as he cleared Charles Leclerc on lap 36 into the Lecombe chicane. It was good defending from Leclerc to try to attack him back, but now Piastri was released to go chase after the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton. And so now Russell had both Hamilton and Piastri trying to chase him down, and it was going to be a really tight finish because Hamilton was gaining on Russell quickly, and Piastri at like double the speed of Hamilton was gaining on Russell. So Russell had to defend hard if he wanted to win this race.
Yeah, going on to lap 37 now, Hamilton could see George Russell, and Piastri was, like you said, rapidly closing up to the back of them. Both Hamilton and Piastri on extremely fresh tires compared to George Russell. So it would be interesting to see what George Russell could do to defend his lead. But going on to lap 39 now, Carlos Sainz overtook Sergio Perez, and Perez at this point have fallen down to P8. So it was just the worst thing that could have happened for him, the worst thing that he could have imagined coming to this race, starting from P2, and exactly the opposite of what Red Bull would have wanted.
Yeah, so on the penultimate lap, then lap 43, Russell was now under immense pressure from Hamilton, who had DRS, but Russell used all of his battery on the Kemmel straight, and he seemed to be able to defend. So now Russell had the strategy to know how to defend against Lewis Hamilton, which was crucial as he went on to the final lap of the Grand Prix. Hamilton had DRS again going into turn one, but he went a little bit wide, and that compromised his exit, and Russell now seemed to have it in the bag as he was more than 6 tenths clear of Hamilton into Eau Rouge and then up the Kemmel straight. And at this point too, Piastri had DRS on the both of them, so he was gaining in and looking to try to get some in on the action come the end of the lap. But Russell survived once again like he did on the lap before, and he by using his battery he was able to keep ahead of his teammate by still with a comfortable lead of more than 5 tenths of a second. But he was going to do enough to hold on and somehow miraculously take this one stop all the way that no one saw coming, taking these hard tires for more than 33 laps. He was able to keep his teammate at bay and take a one stop all the way to the checkered flag and win for the second time this season. And it was a really good effort from him to take that win. And it was a 1-2 for Mercedes, their first of the season, and their first since Russell actually won in 2022. And Piastri in the end took a very comfortable podium for himself.
So yeah, a really good race from George Russell. It was really, he really deserved that win because he made that win for himself. He made the call for the strategy. He managed the tires, and he went the distance to just absolutely crush it all the way home to keep ahead of Lewis Hamilton and Oscar Piastri, who were on much fresher and faster tires. And so we thought Russell would have this win in the bag.
Yeah.
But as it turns out, there was a post-race investigation because obviously all the cars are reweighed and re-inspected after the race to make sure nothing has changed, to make sure they're still at weight. And it was actually found that George Russell's car was underweight. So because of like a lot of the bottoming that happened, like through Eau Rouge, for example, and just general wear and tear on the car and like how it scrapes on the tarmac, the car had actually weared down significantly more than Mercedes were expecting. And so while Hamilton's car didn't have that same issue, George Russell's car did, and since it was underweight, the FIA had to disqualify George Russell from the Belgian Grand Prix, which meant that Lewis Hamilton would inherit that win, Oscar Piastri would inherit P2, and Charles Leclerc would inherit the podium in P3, and George Russell would ultimately walk away from this race with 0 points.
Yeah, it was a crazy result after the race for Russell to get disqualified after having such a brilliant race. But I think he should still be proud, and Mercedes should still be proud for crossing the line in first and second. But yeah, this disqualification had pretty huge impact for the rest of the grid too, as we saw Ricardo now score a point, and a big point for him and V-Carb, and that would kind of solidify now whether he would be able to be significantly in the running now for a Red Bull seat after scoring points. And Perez only in P7 now with this disqualification from the front row. So it was now serious talks, I'm sure, were going to be held at Red Bull.
Yeah, so the point scorers were Hamilton, who won, Piastri at second, Leclerc third. Then came Verstappen, who charged through to P4, which was a brilliant drive from him in probably what was the third fastest car. Then came Lando Norris, who would be a P5, and pretty disappointed with that. Then came Carlos Sainz, Sergio Perez, Fernando Alonso, Esteban Ocon, and Daniel Ricciardo rounding out the top 10. And so with this, Perez another poor performance per Perez. There was interesting talks about whether Daniel Ricciardo or Liam Lawson would be in contention for the Red
Hmm.
Bull seat.
Yeah, we would just have to wait and see come the end of the summer break. But a very chaotic Belgian Grand Prix, and like
Really good race.
once again, yeah, really good race, and hopefully we could see more of this type of action after the summer break. But that's it for F1 then, and this first half of the season concludes with 7 different race winners, the most we've had since 2012, and 3 teams taking 1-2s, then 4 if you count this 1-2 from Mercedes, but pre-disqualification. But hopefully we get to see an intense championship battle come the end of the season. But that's it for this episode, and be sure to join us next time as we take a look at the 2024 Dutch Grand Prix. Thank you.